Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Um, my name is Mark LeBel. I'm an associate here at the Regulatory Assistance Project. I'll be joined today by Jim Lazar, a senior advisor at RAP, and Paul Chernick, president at Resource Insight. We're here to discuss our new manual on electric cost allocation for a new era. We did a webinar in February that covered higher level issues. We will circulate a link to that for anyone that missed it. But today we're doing a deeper dive into technical issues, so thank you for being truly committed to this topic. Before we get started, there are a few logistical details. Because there are a large number of attendees, we will keep all of you muted. You can submit questions in the questions box. We will do our best to get to as many questions as we can. The webinar will run for 60 minutes, but we will stay on for an additional half hour if there are more questions. And finally, you should know that this webinar is being recorded. In a few days, we will send you a link to the recording and the slides. Electric Cost Allocation for a New Era is a publication from the Regulatory Assistance Project. It is a guide to the allocation of electric utility costs between customer classes, but has some bigger implications. You can think of it as a companion volume to an earlier publication, Smart Rate Design for a Smart Future. The most important pieces of this manual are about accounting for the significant changes of the past 30 years and laying out how cost allocation be reformed going forward. Today, we will be going in depth on the more technical parts of the manual, parts 3 and 4, which are about 130 pages long. This is still skimming the surface today, and you can go to the manual for more. I will touch on a couple of key principles first, which come earlier in the manual but provide overarching context. Then we will talk about different functional areas for embedded cost methods: generation, transmission, distribution, storage, and metering and billing. Last but not least, we have a section today on marginal cost studies. The three authors, Jim Lazar, Paul Chernick, and Bill Marcus, have about 130 years of combined experience with utility regulation. They testified on cost allocation issues in 43 states, plus many federal and local regulatory bodies in the US and Canada. I was privileged to be the editor of the manual. The principles I'm touching on today are a small part of what we covered in our previous webinar. The basic premise of the manual is that there have been numerous technological and regulatory changes in the last 30 years. All of those need to be reflected properly in cost allocation methods. Many of the older techniques break down because they just didn't consider what we are dealing with today. The list on this slide is really just some of the technological changes we've seen. One major recommendation of the manual is that the old customer demand energy classifications may have outlived their usefulness. Better functionalization and classification is needed, and we have the data and analytical capabilities to do that. Shared system costs can be classified by time periods. Site infrastructure, billing, customer service, and administrative and general costs can be considered separately. Now, to talk about generation, I'll hand it over to Paul Chernick.
Thank you, Mark. The electric generation fleet, as you may have noticed, is changing rapidly, which requires new approaches to cost allocation. The choice of approach in classifying and allocating generation costs can be very important in determining who pays what share of the utility's revenue requirements. Anybody on the call who's done a cost of service study, been involved with a cost of service study, is probably aware of that fact. This slide excerpts just a few of the generation classification and/or allocation methods discussed in the manual, and focuses on just two of the characteristics we discussed for the various methods. These four methods range from the simplistic and arbitrary straight fixed variable, which ignores the nature, rationale, and use of the generation resources, to the base intermediate peak and equivalent peaker, which do differentiate among resource types, at least in terms of classification between demand and energy drivers, to probability of dispatch, which looks at the hourly use of each resource type. 50 years ago, when cost of service studies were based on calculations on manual calculators and on cumbersome mainframes, and when utilities had very little data on class load shapes, the computational simplicity of straight fixed variable and similar approaches was very attractive. But with modern computers and lots of data, there's really no difference in the difficulty of these various methods. The simplest approaches really have not made sense for decades. The choice of method has long been driven more by the interests of the various customer classes rather than by technical constraints on the analysis. With the increasingly important roles of variable, renewables, and storage, equity requires the use of increasingly sophisticated approaches. Okay, so just looking at one of the methods described on the mentioned on the previous slide, many states have, at one time or another, at least used what we know of as the equivalent peaker or peak credit method for generation cost classification. This method assigns as the cost of capacity, which is then allocated on some kind of demand measure, what a utility would pay for a new peaking resource, historically a combustion turbine, but now more likely a lower cost storage resource. All costs in excess of that peaking cost for any other type of generation are classified as energy related because you make the additional investment to get the energy benefits of those other technologies. So, for example, in this table, 79% of the investment and maintenance costs of a nuclear unit would be treated as energy related. The base intermediate peak method approaches the same problem as the equivalent peaker method, but starting with hourly loads rather than costs. It's one of the early methods of hourly cost allocation, already in use prior to the 1990s, as was equivalent peaker. BIP, which has the advantage of having a cute little acronym BIP, looks at the load duration curve for the utility, assigning the costs of different resources to rough approximations of the hours in which they might be used. This approach does not readily reflect seasonal variation in capacity or limited energy hydro resources that can't run full out all day or all week, requirements for reserves and ramping capacity, generation outages, storage, and non-dispatchable resources like solar and wind. This graphic, like most BIP applications, oversimplifies generation planning and operation a lot, but it's still getting at least a simplified version of the process. A more modern approach is the probability of dispatch method. And when I say modern, I'm talking here about a method that has been in use since the 1980s, when it was really a very difficult method to implement. In this method, the costs of each type of resource are assigned to each hour in which the units are expected to be used, that is either dispatched or providing operating reserves or some other service. In this approach, an industrial class with relatively flat loads, as we've assumed in this table, would be allocated more of the cost of baseload resources, while a commercial class dominated by offices open mostly, say, 8 a.m. to 6 p.m., and very sensitive to weather conditions, so it has very high loads on really hot days, would be charged for more of the peaking resources because that class is using more energy in the hours when the peakers are operating. Now today, with variable renewable energy, we need to deal with resources that are not neatly stacked under a low duration curve, as in probability of dispatch. For example, wind projects provide benefits in windy hours, and the classes that use those services at those times should pay for them. As shown in this graph, wind resources provide energy in different patterns. The Gallegos Ranch, which is in New Mexico, provides more energy in high load hours in the late afternoon and early evening, while this particular West Texas resource on the graph provides much more energy in the overnight hours when it's less useful. So each cost of service study must reflect the nature of the relevant wind resources, those that are in the revenue requirement, to properly assign costs. Similarly, solar resource costs should be assigned to sunny hours. This graphic compares the hourly output patterns for a variety of solar technologies and orientations. The hourly generation pattern will also vary with the location of the solar resource. with resources further west providing energy later in the day. Okay, now let's try to pull those concepts together to illustrate an hourly cost allocation approach. This example breaks the daily load shape into 4 classes. A little street lighting load in the darker hours, a very flat industrial load up at the top, a commercial load that roughly doubles from the early morning hours to the middle of the business day, and residential load, which is less variable than commercial and peaks later in the day. Now here we have a relatively simple set of generation resources that might be used to meet the system load in that previous graph. The top line in megawatts is exactly the same as in the previous graph. And our resources include a base resource, which might be nuclear, peaking turbines, a significant amount of solar generation, and some storage to shift the excess solar and baseload energy into the hours when load is still high, but the solar generation is dropped off. These graphs take the previous information and turn it into costs that assume dollars per megawatt hour over the output of each of these resources. So the vertical axis in the last 2 slides was in megawatts. Now we're looking at dollars on the vertical axis. On the left-hand side, we see the resources with their output in each hour multiplied by the assumed fixed cost of per megawatt hour of the resource. And storage is priced at the resources, say the baseload resource and solar. They're used to charge the storage in addition to its own investment. And fuel costs would be laid on top of this pattern and would be somewhat different. This is just focusing on the fixed cost for this example. The shape of this cost curve is considerably peakier than the load shape because the peaking and storage resources are relatively costly per megawatt hour. On the right, we've taken that same graph and just split it up differently. Instead of splitting it by the resources, we've split it among the classes. Again, with the residential at the bottom and then the commercial and the industrial. Each class would be allocated a share of the cost of resources operated in each hour in proportion to their use in that hour. So that if you look at the far left-hand side, the industrials will be bearing a higher percentage of the cost for that hour than they would for, say, about hour 18 or 19, when you've got a lot of peakers and storage. The cost is much higher, and the relative load of the industrials compared to the total system is lower. Okay, so that covered generation, and many people think of cost allocation as basically being about the generation system. Over time, more and more attention has been paid to the other parts of the cost allocation, starting with transmission. This slide graphically shows how transmission assets serve different functions and therefore require different allocation approaches. First, we have a transmission line built primarily to connect a remote hydroelectric resource, in blue up at the top if you're having trouble seeing this on your screen, down to the load centers, the 4 circles down below. That part of the transmission system exists primarily to make the hydro resource useful, and its cost should be apportioned in the same manner as the hydro resource. It's really part of getting that hydro resource from the running river to the load. Second, we have a transmission line built primarily to connect a wind farm, in red to the lower right, to the load centers in a similar manner. While we don't show examples here, utilities have built similar transmission ties to connect load to remote nuclear and coal plants and to other utilities for imports and for reserve sharing. What we do show is that there are other transmission elements interconnecting these 4 load centers so that they can share both the internal resources, which we show in 3 of the 4 load centers, and also the external resources that come into some of the load centers and need to be shifted to the other load centers. And that's both for reliability, make sure you can always get power to whoever needs it, and for economic dispatch, so that you don't have to run peakers in one of your load centers while you're throwing away wind power being fed into another load center. So this slide's title sort of says it all. There are many types of transmission, and as explained to some extent in the previous slide, there are many different kinds of transmission assets, and they're more described in the manual than we deal with in this presentation, but this gives you a flavor. The associated costs can be allocated to specific hours in a modern allocation method shown on the right, rather than the methods shown in the middle, which are relatively progressive, but somewhat old-fashioned methods that might have been used a decade or more ago. Now, one issue that often comes up is that the retail regulators don't always have the first opportunity to decide how transmission costs will be allocated. Transmission revenue requirements are generally set by FERC, and the way that they're shared among the utilities is determined by FERC and ISO rules. But the critical issue is how the transmission is used. And FERC and the ISOs, inspired by FERC and by the need for relative simplicity in what's already a complicated process for them, use methods that distort the incentives for utilities and other parties, focusing on small numbers of hours, sometimes just 1 hour a year, leading to the use of storage and demand response to shift loads off the hours used in the allocation, regardless of whether those shifts actually improve system reliability or reduce costs. Cost allocation for retail rate making should not be constrained by the methods used at the wholesale level, whether by FERC or by the ISOs. Over time, storage and demand response are likely to be less expensive than transmission for meeting short period and peaking needs. Transmission is likely to become more heavily related to energy and ancillary services than to meeting peak demand. Okay, moving along to my final area, is the allocation of distribution costs. Distribution is built to supply aggregate customer needs, to bring energy from transmission substations down to customers in groups and then eventually individually. On the left, we see an example of a place where a transformer serves a single customer. Those happen to some extent for almost any utility. But more commonly in urban, suburban, and even village situations, one transformer would serve multiple small customers. You usually get one transformer per customer only when the customers are far apart. On the right, we have a transformer bank serving a commercial office building in the foreground using 1 meter, and a 36-unit condominium building in the background with 36 meters. There are, as I count them, 4 or 5 transformers up on that pole. The cost of those transformers and the cost to get the power to the transformers would be the same regardless of the number of meters in each building. You could have 1 meter on each building, you could have 36 on each building, and the equipment necessary to serve them would not be different up through the transformers. Those are the important factors to think about in terms of allocation. The utilities, or many utilities anyway, have sought to use what we call, or has generally been called, the minimum system method. We didn't make this up. Apportioning a large portion of the cost of the shared distribution system on a per customer basis, on some kind of theory that every customer requires a slice of the shared system, a piece of every pole, a piece of every wire. As noted on the previous slide, it's load, not customer number, that drives the amount of the system that needs to be built out. A building could be a large hotel with a single meter, or an apartment building with separate meters for each unit, or an office building with multiple tenants and multiple meters. In any case, the utility provides only a single service connection, provides, as we saw before, a block of transformers or one large transformer. In this picture, 12 apartments plus an extra meter for the common loads are served through a single service connection and a single transformer. These customers require the same feeder investment, transformer investment, and service drop as a single large customer using the entire building. Now, diversity is a key concept in understanding distribution cost allocation. Not so much classification, but the allocation. High load and high cost hours on the generation system are determined by conditions in each hour for the entire system. But when we get to the distribution system, different parts will experience high loads at different times. This graphic shows when the substation loads are highest for one utility. Each dot is one substation. The horizontal axis is month, the vertical axis is the hour of the peak, and the size of the circle is the size of the substation. The various substations experience peak loads in every part of the year: summer, winter, spring, fall, and every part of the day, from early in the morning when it's still dark out till 10 or 11 at night. A single peak hour, or even multiple hours with high aggregate system load, would not be an appropriate basis on which to allocate substation costs. And similarly, there's diversity at the circuit level. This graphic shows another utility's feeders, distribution circuits, and the hour for which each of the distribution circuits reached its maximum demand. The largest number is at 8 p.m. But those peaks, the other peaks are actually more numerous and are spread out from late morning through about 9 o'clock at night, with some outliers at other odd times. Again, a single hour is not appropriate basis on which to allocate these circuit costs. Finally, there's diversity on the customer side of the transformer in urban and suburban areas, or any place that you have customers sharing transformers. This graphic shows for one apartment building the combined highest demand for each customer each month. That is the blue line. That's the sum of the customer maximum demands. And the maximum demand actually experienced by the utility for the building in red. The individual demands here in some months were added up to twice what the utility had to serve at any one time. And the same is true for not just for apartment buildings, but for single family homes along the street or small businesses in a strip mall. The sum of customer individual peak loads, maximum loads, is not an appropriate basis for allocation of transformer or any other distribution costs. So of the shared system elements, that is the substations, the poles, the primary conductors, everything that gets the power out in front of the building, the manual identifies appropriate methods for allocation of all those kinds of costs based on the loads. And this table shows for each of those substation poles and primary conductor categories, shows a reasonable, not particularly archaic legacy method, something that would have been a pretty good approach 30 or 40 years ago, which allocate the demand-related portion based on loads at or near the peak periods and allocate some of the costs to energy as well. But today we have hourly data and can take the approach shown on the right, allocating costs to all hours in which they provide service with an appropriate emphasis on the higher load hours. There are also more localized parts of the system, such as transformers and secondary conductors. These are appropriately allocated based on when the transformer peaks occur and the high load hours in which those components are more stressed. And now I will hand off to Jim to talk about some additional topics.
Thanks very much, Paul. That was excellent. Storage performs a lot of functions within the utility system. The cost allocation method really needs to consider all of these functions. In the functionalization state, part of the cost of energy storage should be attributed to reserves available at all hours, part to energy arbitrage, turning low value power that surplus in some hours into more valuable power that can be used at high load hours. Part to transmission, since one advantage of locating storage within a service territory is to reduce the need for transmission capacity to bring power from far away during peak periods. And for the same reason, part should be functionalized to distribution, because strategically located storage can help minimize distribution capacity costs, and quite a few utilities have built storage specifically for that purpose. Accounting for storage is a real doozy of a challenge for accountants, and therefore also for those of us doing cost allocation studies. The current FERC accounts, 363 and 584.1, are those that are designated for storage costs. These are distribution system costs, and this is left over from when the only storage that utilities had was the little battery banks at substations to keep the communication system going. But most storage today is now built at the site of wind and solar farms, or it's built to reduce transmission costs. And wherever it's built, it's used to provide diurnal load shaping and energy arbitrage. And a lot of the storage actually comes to utilities from independent power producers who are selling solar plus storage or wind plus storage products to the utility. And that gets booked in the purchase power account 555. Frankly, FERC needs to do some work on its system of accounts, but until they do, we as cost analysts need a lot of granular detail about storage costs that the current accounting system may not be providing us. I'll now turn to an item or two about the cost of metering and billing. Traditional analog meters, that on the left, are giving way to smart meters on the right. Over half of residential customers and nearly all large commercial and industrial customers now have some form of smart meters. They cost more than the analog meters they replaced. They do more, and we need to apportion that additional cost carefully. So a simple meter is there for billing, and you need one for every customer. But that's not why you pay extra for smart meters. They do a lot more than measure just kilowatt hours. Just a few examples. They give us circuit by circuit and phase by phase data so that we can do a better job of phase balancing, reduce conductor loading, transformer costs, and line losses. Those are capacity and energy values. They help us figure out where to locate energy storage to reduce generation, transmission, and distribution costs. The communication systems in advanced metering systems not only bring the meter readings to the utility, but they also bring circuit data and transformer data. The network allows demand response programs to operate, carrying signals the other direction to consumers. The bottom line is that these smart grid costs are not customer-related costs the way analog meters were. A very concrete example here. The city of Burbank, California runs a municipal electric utility. They use the data from their AMI system to do a transformer right sizing program, switching around transformers, just moving them around on their system. Some were oversized, some were undersized. And they wound up with avoided reducing line losses by about 1%, saving about $1 million a year on power supply cost. That's a power supply benefit. The manual has an entire section on the allocation of advanced metering infrastructure. This table shows the legacy FERC accounts into which smart grid costs fall and how those costs should be allocated in a modern cost allocation study. I'll just pick one for example. The data collection function used to be meter readers that went out and collected data. That was account 902 and typically treated as customer related. But today, we're collecting interval data by time period, peak load data, information to support demand response, and data to help us reduce line losses. These have demand and energy elements to them, and the cost of smart meters should be partially assigned to these purposes. I'll now turn for a few minutes to marginal cost studies. Only a few states use these for cost allocation, but for them this is important. The manual has a 40-page detailed discussion of marginal cost methods, and if you're in a state that uses or is considering them, certainly it's going to be an important part of the manual for you. There's a lot of different kinds of marginal cost, and all are relevant for some analysis. Short-run marginal costs tell us what changes hour to hour as loads change. This is relevant for rate design, but of limited value, really, for cost allocation. Long-run marginal cost studies are used for cost allocation. The most common method is what we call the NERA methodology. Dr. Alfred Kahn was a pioneer in the use of these methods when he was at NERA. There are some hybrid methods that can be a little confusing. We discuss them in the manual. And there's a concept brought over from the telecom world, total service long-run incremental cost, which looks at the cost of building a new system. Short-run marginal costs really are only looking at variable operating costs. In the transmission and distribution world, there is very little short-run variable cost. Rates based on short-run marginal cost would not come anywhere close to covering the utility revenue requirement. They basically cover the fuel and purchase power costs. While these are argued to be relevant to economic efficiency by some economists, I believe that they are most relevant in the rate design realm, not in the cost allocation realm. The most common marginal cost method that's used in states that use marginal cost studies is the NERA methodology that was pioneered by Kahn and his colleagues at NERA in the late 70s and early 80s. These are typically, unfortunately, a mix of marginal cost methods. They consider the short-run cost of energy based on a dispatch model, together with the capital cost of peakers to serve additional peak demands. They look at typically a 10-year forecast of transmission capacity and needs, and often a long-run method for customer connections, the cost of actually installing new customer connections and new meters, and for billing and collection costs. These methods can be inequitable if the system is either excess in capacity or deficient in capacity. And those factors have led to important refinements from the NERA methodology in, for example, states like California and Oregon that have relied on marginal cost studies for a long time. The manual discusses the option of a total service long-run incremental cost. This is the cost of building a new system with today's technologies optimally configured to serve today's loads. This hypothetical system has no excess capacity. It's the cost a new entrant would incur to serve today's customers if competition were feasible. This may be cheaper or more expensive than the existing system, given the combination of inflation driving costs up since systems were built in the past and technological innovation driving costs down. Marginal generation cost is rapidly changing, and methods that we used even a few years ago are going to be obsolete today. The replacement of fuel-burning resources with wind, solar, and storage eliminates nearly all variable operating costs, but it does not change the character of why the costs are incurred. It's critical to consider the long-run capital and operating costs of new resources in order to equitably treat the apportionment of these new resource costs. Another factor that the manual stresses is the need to use what we call an economic carrying charge rate that nets out inflation in measuring the marginal cost of capital-intensive resources that will be recovered over time in rates that do reflect inflation. I'll focus on one flaw in the NERA methodology for distribution. Because this method uses an intermediate time frame for transmission and sometimes for primary distribution lines, sort of a new construction method for customer connections, it produces results biased against the residential and small commercial customer classes. Fortunately, there's alternatives. The manual discusses a couple of these. Either use the total service long-run incremental cost consistently for all components of the system. That is, look at everything in a long-term perspective, or else use what we call the new customer-only method for estimating marginal customer connection distribution costs. I'll now summarize what we've discussed, and then we can take your questions. Most important, we should generally assign nearly all costs to the hours in which they're providing service. Past distinction between demand-related costs and energy-related costs, that kind of classification may be obsolete in favor of hourly methods. Need to consider investment-related costs and operating costs together to avoid bias. Storage, wind, and solar have almost no operating costs, very different than coal and natural gas. Most Distribution costs are associated with service in particular hours, and the costs need to be assigned to those hours. And finally, customer-specific costs on a system are a very limited piece of costs. Finally, marginal cost analysis really needs to use consistent time periods for analysis. Mark, I'm going to hand it back to you for some questions.
Thanks so much, Jim and Paul. Thanks to those of you who submitted some questions in advance. We'll start there while people get in their questions live. Let's start with something that was touched on a little bit earlier. Jim, can you talk about whether there are any more general changes to the FERC system of accounts for costs besides just storage? Jim, you're muted.
Thanks, Mark.
Sorry
about that. I'm not aware that FERC is really doing much of a job to address solar in particular as a separate production cost category, or any distinction of storage between storage that's located at generation sites, storage located at transmission sites, and storage located at distribution sites. So the analyst is going to have to go beyond the data that's in the that's reported in the FERC Form 1 to actually get from the utility what type of storage, how it's used, and where it's located.
And in addition, within the other generation accounts, there's a lot of variation from combustion turbines to combined cycle to combined heat and power to solar and wind, and those really ought to be broken out in a way that provides some more transparent information. It's fine if you're in a proceeding and you can ask the utility to break out all of those data, but it would be nice to have some publicly available data on what they're spending on these resources.
Thanks. So I think we've gotten 3 questions that have a significant amount of overlap on locational costs, locational value, and calculation of the value of distributed energy resources to distribution systems. Could either of you talk to us first about, can locational cost distinctions, how should that be considered in a cost allocation study? And then any thoughts on passing that further down into rates?
Locational costs are different in utilities in a lot of different ways. Obviously, most people who are in organized markets and one of the ISOs are seeing different nodal prices for power supply at different hours, but there's also different costs at the distribution level in different areas. Some utilities have done separate urban and rural service territory analyses. Those are not common. Postage stamp analysis is more common, but we now have the ability to handle that amount of data, something we really was very difficult in the past. And in the future, it's quite possible that we should be looking at more localized sub areas within cost studies.
Beyond the technical issues, there are also policy choices. Do you want to have a postage stamp rate? If you're going to charge everybody in a class the same rate, regardless of where they're located, do you want to charge every class the same amount for units of distribution, for example, whether they're in a part of the service territory that's easy to serve or the part that's dense and has difficult terrain. And generally, regulators and utilities have opted for the postage stamp, but that is a policy decision. It's not a technical decision. Once you make the policy choice, then you can do the kinds of analyses that Jim was talking about.
Thanks. Following up on that, sort of a related question, what are the costs associated with turning the distribution system into a bi-directional system? How would you think about that in the cost study?
There's not really a lot of change that needs to be done. The main change that utilities with very high solar concentration, and I'm speaking mostly about Hawaii here, where I've done a fair amount of work, is in the area of voltage regulation. Some of it at night is flowing from central power stations, and during the middle of the day is flowing the other direction, often backwards out of a residential area and up to the substation. Voltage regulation is the primary cost, and the way I think that's going to be handled in the future is with smart inverters that can produce the voltage that's needed, and the cost of that is actually going to be borne as part of the specification of the type of inverters that folks have to install. So it won't even be a cost that appears on the utilities books. There may be some other costs. Paul may have some thoughts, but actually that part of it isn't going to be a big deal. The rate design part of it, of whether you charge solar customers distribution cost for only the power they receive from the utility, or also for the power that they deliver to the utility and that goes out over the distribution system, is an important policy decision, but not a technical one.
Utilities may also incur other kinds of costs involving the need to integrate significant amounts of distributed generations, a lot more monitoring of conditions along the distribution system, fault detection, better control of what's happening when power is flowing in from multiple directions. For the most part, that power is benefiting all customers, and it's a generation and transmission and even distribution offset in that it reduces your need perhaps to increase your substation capacity. And so in many cases, I would think that you would allocate those additional costs based on the value of the excess generation from the distributed resources to the system.
I actually co-authored a paper on this with Ryan Leddick from the Brattle Group. It's available on our website. It was actually published by Lawrence Berkeley National Labs. It's entitled Distribution Pricing with Distributed Energy Resources. This is dealing with the pricing side of it, not the cost allocation side. But we looked at 26 different elements of change due to DERs, but the overwhelming majority of them were subsumed within the smart inverter cost. Anyway, you may find that paper useful to look at. It's another level more technical than this webinar. Distribution pricing with distributed energy resources.
Thanks. Here's a good one. I know we have a recent example in New England, what states have deviated away from classifying meters as a customer-related cost in a cost of service study once the utility installs AMI? Recently, there was a policy statement in a New Hampshire grid modernization order that specified that the metering costs related to billing were customer-related, a narrower definition than just the entire metering cost. So do we have other examples, Paul and Jim?
I know there's been discussion of it in California when they adopted when they abandoned the original net metering and moved to NEM 2. And I know it's been discussed in Maryland, but I'm not sure if there's been affirmative decisions in either of those jurisdictions.
Thanks.
Yeah, I'm afraid that I failed this pop quiz. I know I've seen those considerations taken into account, but I don't remember which jurisdiction.
Yeah, the New Hampshire order is I think the most on point.
Great. So here's a fun one. If all generation, transmission, and distribution are on hourly prices, do we need customer classes? As moderator, I'll point out that there's a distinction between hourly cost allocation and hourly prices, but still, it's fun to think about.
Maybe not. You know, some utilities have, as they've moved to time varying pricing, have simply separated by voltage class. That is secondary voltage, primary voltage, transmission voltage, where there are still very distinct cost differentials. Primary customers don't get assigned the cost of line transformers and secondary lines. Transmission voltage customers don't get assigned the costs of primary distribution in general, but you may not need any more distinct customer classes than that. I've worked with a number of utilities that have moved to consolidate their residential and small general service classes into a single secondary service class.
On the other hand, you also have some things that vary between, say, multifamily residential, where they will often be sharing a service drop, and certainly will be sharing transformers, to single family residential, to the often larger small commercial that are not as diverse in terms of their use of transformers, for example. And you may want to continue using customer classes to reflect some of the differences in how customers in each class, as we think of them now, tend to be interconnected. For generation costs and transmission costs, you may be able to have the same rates for everybody.
Yeah, actually, this ties into our previous publication, Smart Rate Design for a Smart Future, where on the rate design side, we propose a customer charge that only covers billing and collection costs, and then a site infrastructure cost for each customer that is the amount of dedicated secondary voltage service lines and transformer that serves each customer or each group of customers. And in that approach, the apartment customers would pay a much lower site infrastructure charge than a single family home would. And in fact, we see that in there are several utilities. Manitoba Hydro is the first one I dealt with many, many years ago, that have separate separate monthly fixed charges depending upon the size of the transformer or site infrastructure. And if you have that kind of a rate design, then you may not need a separate rate class for multifamily. But I think I agree with Paul. I think that multifamily customers being charged the same rates as single family customers is probably the single largest disparity between costs and rates that we see. There are states like Nevada that have separate multifamily rates. The customer charge is about 10% lower. The energy charge is about 10% lower, reflecting the fact that the customer charge that the service drop and investment is, transformer investment is lower for multifamily, and in the energy charge that the shared distribution cost investment for multifamily is lower per kilowatt hour. So the single family multifamily issue is one that we discuss in the manual, and we also discuss in our rate design work as an area that probably the most severe overcharges, in my opinion, are forcing multifamily customers to have very low distribution costs to pay as much as single family customers for their connection and distribution costs.
Thanks, Jim. This is a good one. How do you suggest approaching a vertically integrated utility operating in an RTO where the pattern of that utility's annual generation is very different than their load shape?
Well, okay, so we're talking about generation allocation. And I would think that the relevant consideration would be the load shape. Sometimes the supply is imports from the ISO or RTO, and sometimes it's generation by the utility or some combination thereof.
I've actually done this on a couple of utilities, and what I chose to do was to use the hourly market clearing prices from the ISO for that utility's nodes to value, to parse out the generation costs. So I used an hourly method with the ISO market clearing prices, but then use those ratios by time periods to apportion the actual generation cost that the utility incurred, which was because of its low-cost resources overall somewhat lower than the RTO costs, ISO costs.
One way of thinking about it is that the utility has some resources, many of them legacies from earlier time periods, that it sells into the market, and it's got costs for those resources and it's got revenues for those resources, and the difference between those two flows to its retail customers, and then it buys power from the system to serve the retail customers. So you can do just what Jim was talking about, and then you need to figure out how you're going to allocate the gain or loss on the operation of the utility zone system among customers, which you may want to do just in proportion to the allocated costs of power and capacity being used to serve load.
All right.
Thanks, Paul.
I'm going to take this back to the summary, and we'll wrap up this hour. The key factors that we focused on in the last hour have been assigning nearly all costs to the hours for which they're incurred, to eliminate the distinction between demand-related and energy-related costs in that process, to consider investment-related and operating costs together to avoid bias involving resources that have very little in the way of operating costs. The distribution costs, the shared distribution costs, are associated with service in hours and need to be assigned to those hours, not on a simple demand or customer basis. But the customer-related costs on the system are very, very limited, and that marginal cost studies must be constructed to use consistent time periods for analysis of generation, transmission, and distribution costs.
Thanks, Jim. Now that we're at the top of the hour, we will keep taking questions. We have a bunch more in the queue. So happy to have you stick with us for a little while longer if you'd like to do that. So I think one question worth emphasizing is, how do you quantify and value diversity within rate classes that was discussed? One might say that's the whole point of cost allocation, but what are your thoughts on that point?
Did you just ask us to define the universe and give 3 examples?
Well, I think it's just worth putting a point on this question, that diversity is used in the process, maybe not in the data that we have, correct?
Well, the problem is that large customers have a lot of diversity on the customer side of the meter, and small customers have diversity on the utility side of the meter. For example, in a apartment building with very small apartments, everybody gets up. Some people use their hair dryer, some use their toaster, some use their microwave, some use their coffee pot. The individual customers are using power quite erratically. An individual apartment that has a hair dryer and a coffee pot and the microwave all going at the same time could easily have 6 or 7 kW of demand for a 15-minute interval. But by the time it gets with the other 29 apartments in the building to the utilities service bank, it's maybe 1 kW of per customer contribution to the building's peak demand that influences transformer size. On the other hand, in a very large home with 6 or 8 or 10 occupants, the hair dryer is running more hours, the coffee pot's running more hours, the toaster is running more hours, the microwave's running more hours, and there's more diversity on the customer side of the meter. Simply taking diversity into account based on the metered data discriminates against the apartment dwellers, the small users with the more erratic consumption, even though we know from a number of specific studies that the small use customers actually have better load factors across the year, better load shapes across the year than the large customers, simply because the share of their consumption that is electric air conditioning or electric heat is a smaller share of the total than for the large use customers. If we use just the meter data and operate our diversity analysis from the meter data, we're skewering the small use customers in the analysis.
In other words, diversity matters. A customer's own maximum demand for a month or a year has very little to do with its costs on the system. And the class's non-coincident demand, the hour during the year or the month in which the class as a whole is estimated to have had its highest load, that has little or nothing to do with the class's contribution to the system costs. And you either want to look hourly at the loads and the equipment that's in use and who's using it, or you want to just look at in some cases you can just look at a limited number of high use hours, and again, who's contributing those high use hours, but it's high use on that equipment. All the customers on the feeder, or all the customers on the substation, or all the customers in the utility system.
Yeah, there's one little piece of this that's really important, which is the transformers are, a lot of the utilities measure demand in the 15-minute interval. And some actually bill customers for the demand based on their highest use in the highest 15-minute interval. Transformers are not sized based on the expected maximum 15-minute interval. We have a section in the manual that talks about how transformer sizing takes into account how high the load will be for how many hours in a row. a transformer can handle all 200% overload for 15 minutes quite easily. And so you wouldn't size a transformer to the 15-minute load. But if that load is high for 4 or 5 or 6 hours in a row, that transformer heats up and it ages faster. And so with the one specific element of transformer sizing, a short duration demand interval is really completely irrelevant to the cost causation of that component of the system.
Great.
I think we've answered that question completely 3 different ways.
It's important. How would storage as a transmission asset be treated?
Well, I have a slide that shows that storage needs to be functionalized between all of the benefits that it provides in generation, transmission, distribution, and reserves. The energy arbitrage function, moving power around. So some part of that cost should be treated as a transmission-related cost, and it's should be based upon the cost savings from not having to take higher transmission deliveries from the ISO and pay the ISO transmission rate for it for just a few hours a year, when that can be more economically served with storage. But once that storage is installed and sited in a location to minimize transmission costs, you're also going to use it for energy arbitrage and reserves. And so just because you chose to put that storage unit in that location to minimize transmission costs doesn't mean you're not going to use it for the other functions, and therefore you need to assign part of the costs to those other functions.
If it's on the transmission system, does that mean that there's no distribution benefits, so you wouldn't functionalize that part of it?
Yeah, that would generally be the case.
I think you lose the distribution function. And for example, there's a lot of storage is located at the site of wind and solar farms, and those aren't going to provide distribution benefits. They're going to provide energy arbitrage benefits and reserve function benefits.
So if you're building storage to optimize the use of your solar, for example, you could, but it also provides various reserve benefits and other ancillary services. Then you could either take the approach of, well, how much is it worth for allowing us to get more solar out of this system, or how much transmission does it save given the size of the solar farm, and then also look at how much is it worth in terms of the ancillary system services and whatever other functions that it provides.
Yeah, the other
and allocate the costs in proportion to that. Or you can say, we built it for the solar. It's a generation, it's part of the generation cost for the solar, but we're going to credit it with the value that it provides for these other
let me turn it around. There's a fair amount of storage that's installed on customer premises, and getting the utility access to that solar for reserves and ancillary services and perhaps energy arbitrage, and for transmission and distribution capacity relief is important. There's one utility that's done a pretty good job of this, Green Mountain Power in Vermont, where the utility pays half of the cost of a battery bank, and the customer pays half, and the customer gets the reliability benefits. In a power outage, there's a battery full of power that can serve the house, but the utility takes the utility side benefits. And You know, I haven't thought about the cost allocation study that would be appropriate for that utility, but clearly the utility is incurring a cost for half of that storage, and that cost needs to be apportioned among the utility benefits that it gets, which are separate from the customer reliability benefits that the customer gets.
Great. So we have another question on distributed energy resource valuation, which is interesting. Is it possible to value long-term distribution system costs or avoided costs without a marginal cost study?
Well, you're certainly going to be looking at, I mean, the costs that you will avoid over the next 30 years are the long-run marginal costs. And so you're going to need to know what long-run marginal costs for that component is. I don't know that you're going to need a full system long-run marginal cost study. And if you did, whether it should be something that started with the nearer methodology but equalized the time horizon, or you simply use a total service approach where everything is considered to be a variable cost. Because in the long run, all costs are variable.
Thanks, Jim. Is there anything different about the costs of securitizing plant retirements when you're in states that are considering this?
Well, the costs go down, and the assets need to be sort of excised from the cost allocation study, because the cost allocation study is usually based on equalizing. I mean, one of the outputs, and we have a section in the main law on how to use the results of study, is to either equalize the profit margin or equalize the rate of return across customer classes. And where the cost of capital is fundamentally different for something like it is under securitization, I think those costs need to be excised from the cost of service study formulas and then added into the results, so that the higher cost of capital that carries the generation, transmission, and distribution system isn't accidentally applied to the lower capital cost associated with an asset that's been securitized. We did call this
basically
a webinar, and I 108 people left, and I hope that half of them had some idea what I just said.
Basically, securitization reduces the cost, but you should be looking to recover that cost from the whatever the residual cost is, in the same way that you would have the original cost. So if this was a baseload plant, and you would have allocated it based on, say, total energy, then the securitized cost should be allocated the same way. And as Jim said, you want to break it out from rate base, which is generally what would happen with the accounting system, because the securitized cost would be a line item bill from the special purpose entity that issues the bonds.
All right, we're getting, there's a pretty high level one that was submitted in advance. What are joint costs, and why is there no precise means of allocating them? This is the real, this is the long paragraph essay portion of the Q&A.
Well, yeah, you could say that. Actually, my master's thesis was on joint cost allocation and time of use allocation. And let's see how much I can remember from 43 years ago. I think the important thing to think about here is that joint costs arise when you've got one item that provides two separate services. For example, you've got a pole that carries distribution wires, but it also is used to hold a 5G internet connection. So if you're looking at pricing those services, you're not adding anything to the cost of the pole by adding on the 5G. And if you wanted to have the 5G in that location without the distribution system, the pole would be just as expensive. So that one pole provides the two services for the same cost. That's a joint cost. A classic version is you raise a steer and you turn it into beef and into leather. All of the inputs that went into raising that animal are joint costs. You couldn't get either the leather or the meat if you didn't feed it and take care of it. And the general answer is you look at the justification for undertaking this joint project. And if the cost of if you are putting up lots of poles because you need to have lots of poles for your distribution system, and the 5G system would be perfectly happy to use just 10% of those and doesn't care which, you've got a surplus of poles from the viewpoint of the 5G. And there's really no rationale for allocating any pole costs to the 5G system based on the factors leading to the cost being incurred. On the other hand, there's a general principle that most regulators like to depend on, that rejects the idea of free riders. If you're using some part of the system, even if you're not really causing the cost to increase, you got to pay something towards it. And so,
well, let me give an example.
In those kinds of situations, yeah, go on.
Let me give an example of something I worked on that was a pretty interesting joint cost issue. City of Burbank deployed AMI system, was a very large smart grid grantee during the Recovery Act of 2009 era. When they got the whole system up and running, the first thing they did with it, I mentioned earlier, they did their transformer right sizing project. They reduced their billing and collection costs, enabled them to identify places where they needed to put capacitors on their system to deal with reactive power issues. That provided them substantial cost savings. When they were all done, there was no rate increase at all for smart grid. The cost savings on the system more than offset the costs to the system. But when they tested the meter reading function, the Wi-Fi mesh to the fiber optic ring, they found that they could read all the meters in the city in 9 minutes a month. So they started reading them in the middle of the night at the beginning of each month, and eliminated billing cycles. Everybody got billed on a calendar month basis. That simplified billing and customer service considerably because there was no prorating going on. But then the general manager said, well, what are we going to do with this system the rest of the time if we only need it 9 minutes a month? And they decided to open it up to free citywide Wi-Fi. Relatively low speed, not fast enough to stream high-def video, for sure. They didn't want to be trying to compete. They didn't have the capacity to compete with the cable company. And that provided, adequate free email and browsing access to everybody in the community. It eliminated the digital divide in Burbank. So how would you allocate the costs between the electric system and the Wi-Fi system? Well, they decided to allocate none to the Wi-Fi system. And then COVID came along, and the school district started having to do remote teaching of students. And while in my school district in Olympia, our school district spent over $1 million extending internet service to unserved students, in Burbank, it was already there. And those students could start distance learning simply with the $30 tablets that had already been made available to the lower income students to be able to do their lessons and homework from home. It got allocated no costs, but I don't think anyone would argue that it produced no benefits. That was one aspect. It was simply a joint product of having put in the type of AMI system that they chose, that it produced the societal benefit. People of Burbank certainly consider it a benefit. They're paying for it in their electric bills as demand energy expense in their monthly bills.
And a more interesting application for AMI would be the fact that it jointly gives you the ability to provide some customer services like billing and disconnection, if you want to consider disconnection to be a service remotely, but it also provides information that's useful for the distribution system and services that allow you to reduce line losses and improve power factor, and has value for the transmission and generation system as well. So this one device and its supporting services serves a whole bunch of functions. And the basic answer is that there is no unique way of dividing those costs up in a regulated environment. If you can figure out how much they're worth, you shouldn't be charging more for any one of the services than it's worth. And if you're lucky and the AMI, for example, is cost effective, you can charge less than it's worth to each of the components, and make the generation users, the transmission users, distribution users, everybody better off with that allocation.
I prefer to think of reconnection as a service, and one advantage of an AMI system that enables remote activation of the meter is that as soon as the bill is paid, the power can be reactivated. You don't have to wait to roll a truck and get a service person to the premises.
Thanks. Our next question: what has been published on cost allocation for carbon dioxide removal? I assume that's the incremental costs of any incremental costs of lower GHG resources.
Well, the cost of removal or the cost of emissions is properly added to the operating costs for carbon emitting resources. And obviously, if the carbon is priced as it is in California, it comes directly to the utility as a cost of generation, and is then, flows through the hourly allocation scheme. When the coal plant is running, the costs are incurred, and the costs will get assigned to the appropriate hours when the coal or natural gas plant is running. And when the solar and wind resources are delivering, it's not a part of the cost, and those don't get assigned to, there are no carbon costs assigned. Where the costs have not been monetized, it's going to be a matter of policy for the regulator to decide if they should be reflected. In my state, in Washington, while carbon costs are not currently monetized, we have a recent state law that requires the utility regulator to use a social cost of carbon in its analytical process. And so we're just beginning to discuss how carbon costs will be included in a cost allocation study, even though they're not part of the utility revenue requirement. Oh.
Yeah, I don't think you're going to see carbon capture and storage showing up in many utility cost allocation studies. But if you did, you'd have to look at what function the CCS is serving for the utility. It may be that the utility has a carbon cap, and that it somehow has to reduce its emissions, and the least cost way of doing that is to put a carbon capture system onto a coal plant. But I wouldn't necessarily allocate the cost of that system along with the coal plant, because it's really to meet a target that's a constraint that's binding because of the operation of the coal plants, but also the utilities gas plants, and perhaps that ought to be allocated along with or in proportion to the carbon emissions over the hours, rather than only on the basis of when that coal plant is running. But as I say, I think it's pretty much an academic exercise, unless somebody comes up with a much cheaper way of capturing carbon.
All right, we're going to do one last question here. Someone a little mischievous submitted a two-part question. The first of which I'm not sure we're qualified to answer. What is the meaning of life? Shout out to our friend who submitted that question.
That's the third publication in this series. We've taken care of rate design, cost allocation.
That will be published posthumously.
So the second part of that question, I'm not sure if they're related. Can a cost of service study done for a whole class reliably inform the cost to serve distributed generation customers within that class?
I think it can, if it's separately identifying the cost to connect to the grid, which will vary with the customer's connection needs, and the cost of the shared grid, which should be assigned to the hours in which the customer is receiving grid services and the magnitude to which they are. But this really comes back to more of a rate design question. In our Smart Rate Design for a Smart Future publication, we actually show how that kind of rate design of separating out the cost to connect to the grid from the cost of the grid itself work for DER customers.
Right, and if you have a very complex rate design that flows through hourly costs, then it really shouldn't matter what's going on the customer side of the meter and how they're getting a particular load shape, whether it's with storage or solar or whatever.
Yeah,
but if you're taking the cost of service study and coming up with a rate design that has a customer charge and an on-peak energy charge and an off-peak energy charge with, using 8 or 12 hour time periods, what makes sense for an average residential customer or a small commercial customer or whatever may not make sense for the DG customer. And then you're talking about how do you do the rate design so that it works? Yeah, or you need a separate class.
I'm participating in a technical workshop with the Hawaii PUC that starts in half an hour. And one of the things they're going to be looking at is how does the utility get access to the customer's storage to provide grid services, and how does the utility compensate the customer that has on-site storage for the use of their storage? This is something that Green Mountain Power has addressed in a fairly crude but simple way that seems to be attractive to customers. But there's, the utility side of the meter storage can be functionalized in the way I showed in the slide earlier. But the customer side that the utility acquires by some kind of payment or credit or other recognition of value in the pricing scheme, that compensation needs to be functionalized as to the benefits it provides in generation and transmission and distribution, reserves and ancillary services for the utility. So I think we're We're done with questions here. I'm going to touch on our summary issues one more time. Costs should mostly be assigned to the hours for which they're incurred. The distinction between demand-related and energy-related costs is probably obsolete and needs to be replaced with hourly analysis. We need to consider investment-related costs and operating costs together to avoid bias when we're dealing with new resources that have little in the way of operating costs. Most distribution costs are associated with service in different hours of the year, some of it at all hours, and the cost of oversizing the system in peak hours. The costs that are truly customer related are very limited in nature, and marginal cost studies really need to use consistent time periods for analysis of generation, transmission, and distribution costs. 3/4 of a century ago, the Supreme Court ruled that allocation of costs is not a matter for the slide rule. It involves judgment of a myriad of facts, has no claim to an exact science. Today, despite much better data, much smarter regulators, and much better technology, this remains true. Good analysis is very important. A careful judgment is absolutely essential. Mark?
Thanks everyone for joining us. I hope you're all staying safe, and best wishes to everyone for their family and their health. Thank you, everybody.